Iconic. That's how we're going to look back on the 2025 Rolex 24. It was a race that had it all, from a grandstand finish in GTP to some of the hardest and closest racing that we've potentially ever seen in the GTD Pro class. And there was late race drama that constantly shook up the class leaders. This is your 2025 Rolex 24 at Daytona race recap. All week long, the 2025 Rolex 24 was shaping up to be iconic. In the lead up to the race, we saw some unfamiliar names at the top of the GTP class. Now, BMW and Lamborghini have both had their unique struggles over the past couple of seasons, but this week they seemed to put many of those struggles behind them. They looked poised for a potential breakout this week, and after qualifying, BMW backed that up by putting that M Hybrid V8 on pole. One thing, however, that severely impacted the running in the lead up to this race was the weather. Cold, chilly, and at times rainy weather impacted the practice and qualifying sessions in the lead up to the race. And come race day, we ultimately saw conditions that we hadn't seen at any point in the week prior. Sunny, somewhat warm conditions, much like this that we ended up finishing the race under as well. And this ultimately led to the question of who would emerge with a setup that would do well under these warm and sunny conditions. And how would teams be able to prepare for this after a week of sort of gloomy, rainy, cold conditions? We'll start off with GTP, and as I said a moment ago, Lamborghini was one of those teams that looked poised for a breakout this week. After showing really strong pace in testing, what ended up happening in the race was kind of the complete opposite of what they were looking for. Early in the race, they had issues that forced the car behind the wall early and ultimately into retirement. They completed just 34 laps in their first Rolex 24. This result comes on the heels of Riley taking over as operators of that car, and it really just continues a very difficult start to the life for this SC63. There are still positives, of course, for them to take away from this, but ultimately a very disappointing result for them. On a more positive note, though, the other breakout candidate, BMW, carried that strong pace through into the opening stints of this race. They looked strong in the sunny opening hours of the race, right along with Acura, who paced much of the opening afternoon. The two remaining manufacturers that I haven't touched on yet really came to life at night. Kamui Kobayashi would put on an absolute clinic off of a safety car restart, charging from 9th place to 1st place in about 14 minutes. Unfortunately, though, later in the night, disaster would strike for Cadillac. On a restart, the number 40 Wayne Taylor Racing Cadillac would be caught up in the biggest wreck of the race. It was a hard hit and unfortunately led them to not finishing this race. A big disappointment there for a car that's shown so well in this race in previous years, and in particular for the 40, who looked very strong in the opening stints of the nighttime. From here, things just kind of continued to go downhill for Cadillac. As I said, they are one of the manufacturers that's shown so much pace in the first two runnings of the Rolex 24 with these LMDH cars anyways, and for the third year in a row, they really have nothing to show for it. With just over 13 and a half hours to go, their sister, number 31 Cadillac, would also get caught up in an accident. This one looked like something potentially broke on the car, maybe they had a tire that was going down, but it was a hard hit for the 31, who ended up going into the NASCAR turn 4 wall hard and bringing out another full course yellow. Meanwhile, the remaining Cadillac that was in contention for this win, the number 10, had problems of their own. They would struggle down the stretch, ultimately picking up a few penalties and finishing in 5th place. The manufacturer that emerged from all of this, though, as the clear-cut favorite in the nighttime and into the morning hours was Porsche. Both the 6 and the 7 looked very strong during the nighttime hours and would carry that pace through into the morning. Now, we've often seen cars in this race that show well during the nighttime hours, but just can't keep that pace going when the sun comes back out in the morning. Porsche managed to reverse that trend. They emerged as the clear-cut favorites today. And after a late charge from BMW that actually saw them pick up some nose damage from contact, they would again be tested by the number 60 Meyershank Racing Acura in the closing hour. After some late full course yellows really bunched up the field, this number 60 mounted their charge. They were able to get around the sister number 6 Porsche with just a few minutes remaining, but unfortunately were unable to close the gap to the 7. If we had just a few more minutes left in this race, man, I do think the 60 may have been able to track down the 7 and give us a heck of a fight for the race win, but that didn't come to be, and at the end of it, it was the number 7 Porsche Penske Motorsports 963 who wins back-to-back Rolex 24s. Felipe Nasr, Nick Tandy, and Lawrence Van Tor brought Porsche Penske back-to-back back-to-back Rolex 24 victories, and with the win, Nick Tandy has now won the 24 Hours of Le Mans, 24 Hours of Spa, the Nürburgring 24, and the Rolex 24, which has never been done before. They beat out the number 60 Meyer-Shank Racing at the end by just 1.3 seconds. And rounding out the podium was the number 6 Porsche. I really think we're going to be talking about the battles that we saw take place in this GTP class for a long time. All 4 manufacturers, heck, I'm even going to throw in Lamborghini to the mix here, had a realistic path to winning this race. And I don't think that's something we could have realistically said in the first 2 years of this GTP class. And what's even more impressive is this came after so many wild changes in this past IMSA silly season. Both Meyer-Shank Racing and Wayne Taylor Racing, 2 teams that saw huge program changes this past offseason, showed great pace in this race and really looked like they'd been running these cars for multiple years. I think the racing that we saw in the GTP class paints a really positive picture for what we could be in for the rest of 2025. Meanwhile, the LMP2 class just quietly continued to deliver. The class provided plenty of drama, especially in the closing hours when it seemed like half the grid at one point or another seemed like they weren't going to be able to make it on fuel or were picking up some sort of a penalty, running into a mechanical issue like the 99 AO Racing entry of Spike did in the closing hours with an unfortunate electrical issue. But the LMP2 class really kept us on our toes. In the end, it was the number 8 Tower Motorsports entry of Sebastian Bourdais, John Ferrano, Job van Aert, and Sebastian Alvarez. They beat the number 22 United Autosport entry to the line by 44 seconds after a late emergency service call in the last full course yellow forced the 22 to come back down pit road on the restart. The number 74 Riley would round out the podium. This win for Tower Motorsports was huge. They rebounded from an early race incident with about 20 hours to go that saw the car spun out on the exit of the bus stop and saw them come all the way back to win this race. And with a full season driver lineup of Sebastian Bourdais and John Ferrano, this looks like a car that's a legitimate contender for the LMP2 championship. Overall, though, we saw so many different entries that could win in the LMP2 class today, and this is clearly just a class that's going to provide us with many different winners and many different championship contenders as the season rolls on. Man, what can I say about the GTD Pro class? It once again left us speechless. It was a multi-manufacturer battle that saw just about everyone in this class being in contention for the race win at one point or another. I mean, we saw Pfaff Motorsports and their Lamborghini pace the GTD Pro class for the opening stint before a small issue set them back, and ultimately they would get caught up in a race-ending crash, the same one that took out the number 40. But we saw Lamborghini at the front. We also saw Mercedes at the front, a manufacturer that doesn't even have a full season entry in the GTD Pro class. They were duking it out for most of this race with your full season championship contenders, manufacturers like Porsche, BMW, Ford, and Corvette. And speaking of Ford, BMW, and Corvette, they brought us some iconic moments in the closing hours of the race. The battle between the 3 of them in the final hours was rough and honestly at times probably crossed the line. But nonetheless, it's going to be a battle that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the season, let alone probably years from now. All of this would culminate with a few key moments in the GTD Pro class. After being in contention earlier in the race, one of the BMWs got caught up in that big incident earlier. And in the middle of a battle between Corvette and BMW late in the race, that same BMW that was, again, out of contention was blocking and helped force contact between the 4 Corvette and the number 1 BMW. The contact caused damage to the Corvette and ultimately forced them to come down pit road multiple times to repair it. Not only that, but that BMW would also pick up a penalty for blocking. At the end of the day, this was just kind of uncalled for. An out of contention car inserting themselves into the battle for a race win, let alone a win as big as the Rolex 24, is just something that you do not want to see. This is not the last that we would hear of some BMW and Corvette contact, though, as Corvette would ultimately get the last laugh here, as with under 5 minutes to go in the race, that number 4 Corvette, which charged back, was battling for position with the remaining in contention BMW. I think at this point, it's reasonable to say they just cleaned them out. They gave them the bump going into turn 1. The number 1 BMW ultimately spun around and ruined any chance that they had at picking up a podium. For their troubles, the number 4 Corvette did pick up a penalty as a result of the incident, but the sister number 3 Corvette, which was running ahead of both of them barely at the time, was of course free to fight for that podium. In the end, though, neither Corvette or BMW would take the win in the GTD Pro class. It was the number 65 Ford Multimatic Mustang of Dennis Olsen, Fred Verveech, and Chris Meese. They beat out the number 3 Corvette by 1.9 seconds, while the number 64 Ford rounded out the podium. I mean, my biggest takeaway from this GTD Pro class here is just the overall competitiveness that we saw displayed of all the manufacturers. As I said, it seemed like every manufacturer had an opportunity to win this race at one point or another. And sure, while we saw some not so clean racing take place, we also got to see some of the best professional GT drivers in the world duke it out throughout this entire race. It was non-stop bumper-to-bumper racing. And despite those incidents that we saw at the end of the race, the final 6 or 8 hours, even longer than that, felt like the GTD Pro class leaders were bumper-to-bumper. It was some great racing. It was a ton of fun to watch, and hopefully these late incidents don't overshadow some of the incredible racing that we saw in this class. And honestly, it's incredible racing that I hope we're going to see continue throughout this season. Now, if you're like me, you've probably found yourself at a race weekend with your camera wondering why your photos don't look as good as the professionals. If this is you, then go check out Paddock Focus photography workshops. You're already familiar with the incredible work that Paddock Focus co-host Jamie Price does right here on Off in the S's. His photos are featured here all the time. You can learn from him and fellow photographer Drew Gibson right in the comfort of your home. Everything from how to become a motorsports photographer to race-specific guides like how to shoot the 12 hours of Sebring. There really is something for everyone. For Off in the S's viewers, Paddock Focus is offering a 10% discount when you use the promo code S's. That's promo code S's, and it can be used at paddockfocus.teachables.com, or you can click the link in the show notes. Once again, thanks to Paddock Focus for supporting the show. Now, much like the GTD Pro class, GTD saw a lot of action in this race as well. We saw entries like the Heart of Racing, AWA, Windward Racing, and Wright Motorsports all lead over 100 laps. But in the closing hours, a clear favorite emerged. Perhaps looking like an unlikely contender at the beginning of the weekend, but it was AWA, fresh off of winning the Bob Akin Bronze Cup Award last season with Ore Fadane and automatic invite to Le Mans, saw the number 13 emerge as the ones to beat. It certainly wasn't a walk in the park for them, though, and in the closing green flag stint of the race, we saw the 13 and the number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin duke it out, make a little bit of contact, but ultimately was some clean, hard racing. The 13 was able to just stay ahead, and ultimately the two would get separated a bit by some traffic that they encountered, and the 13 was able to ride that lead to the finish. The number 13 AWA Corvette, driven by Matt Bell, Ore Fadani, Lars Kern, and Martin Kirchhofer, beat the number 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche, who led again for so much of this race, beat them by 1.4 seconds. The number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, who they had that hard battle with at the end, would go on to finish third. Now, at the end of this race, the GTD and actually those LMP2 battles as well probably flew under the radar. We saw so many good battles in GTP and GTD Pro that it was hard to keep up with them all. But here we saw another great storyline emerge. This was AWA's first win in the GTD class, after of course they picked up a win in this same race a couple of years ago in LMP3. But I think what this class kind of showed us in this race is just how difficult it's going to be to predict over the course of the season. I don't think this is going to be the same GTD class that we've seen in past years, where we've seen, Pfaff Motorsports, Windward Racing, the Paul Miller Racing, all run away with championships. There are some incredibly strong driver lineups in this class, and I think we're going to see a lot of different winners and a lot of different contenders as the season rolls on. Let's take a quick look at the point standings now, presented by P1 Web Development. If you're looking for a custom website, then look no further than P1 Web Development. In GTP, it's the number 7 Porsche Penske Motorsports 963 with 380 points. That's a 35-point lead over the number 60, a 59-point lead over their sister number 6 Porsche, while the number 24 BMW and number 10 Cadillac round out the top 5. In LMP2, it's number 8 Tower Motorsports that lead with 369 points. That's 14 more points than the number 22 United Autosports entry. The number 74 Riley, number 52 PR1 Matheson Motorsports, and number 18 Era Motorsports Motorsports will all round out the top 5. In GTD Pro, it's the number 65 Ford Multimatic Motorsports Mustang that leads with 382 points. That's 34 points ahead of number 3 Corvette. 47 points ahead of the sister number 64 Mustang, with the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW and the number 69 Get Speed Mercedes rounding out the top 5. And then in GTD, it's the number 13 AWA Corvette that leads with 365 points. That's just a 10-point advantage over the number 120 Wright Motorsports Porsche, with the number 27 Harder Racing Aston Martin, number 57 Windward Racing Mercedes, and number 96 Turner Motorsports BMW rounding out the top 5. I also want to mention the Support Series action that we saw this weekend. Race 1 for the Mazda MX-5 Cup saw some tricky and cold conditions, but ultimately saw Tyler Gonzalez take the win there. Race 2, though, was one of the talking points of the weekend. And unfortunately, unlike it usually is with the Mazda MX-5 Cup, it wasn't about a photo finish, but rather it was for a huge wreck that we saw going into the first corner of the first lap. A bump gone wrong is the best way to describe it, and the end result was a bunch of twisted MX-5 Cup cars. In fact, 13 were forced to retire from the race as a result, and I heard that 4 cars were damaged beyond repair. In addition to those 13 that retired, there were others that were involved but were able to continue on. Honestly, you just hate to see a big wreck like this, and with some of the limited budgets that you see in the MX-5 Cup, it really makes you wonder if that could be the end of some of those drivers' seasons. Hopefully at the end of the day it's not, and they're able to be there for round 2 at St. Pete, but a really unfortunate set of events that really put a damper on this MX-5 weekend. After a 25-minute full course yellow, we went green with 20 laps to go. And the end of this race was more of one of those typical MX-5 Cup finishes, but here Jared Thomas played the final corners perfectly, textbook if you will. Got a good run coming out of NASCAR Turn 4 and would win what ended up being a photo finish. The other sports series that was present this weekend was the Michelin Pilot Challenge. Here, as it often is, there was a late full course yellow that bunched up the field. And the final 20 minutes of the race saw some incredible battles, both in GS and in the TCR class. The story of the weekend had been Porsche and Ford's dominance. They had cleaned up in qualifying, cleaning up in practice, and for the first 3 hours and 40 minutes of this race, were dominating. However, McLaren and the accelerating performance McLaren Artura GT4 of Moise Uretsky and Michael Cooper would go on to pick up the win ahead of the RS1 Porsche and the core Ford Mustang. TCR, meanwhile, featured an incredible finish as well. By just under 0.07 of a second, and after a few laps of battling, the number 76 Brian Herta Autosports Hyundai of Preston Brown and Denny Dupont picked up the win over the sister number 33 Hyundai. The number 7 Precision Racing Audi rounded out the podium. Of course, as many of you know, Aaron Pfeiffer, who is the co-host of 4Doors and GT4s you can watch live right here on the channel, is involved in that number 76 entry, so a big congratulations to Aaron and the whole team on a huge win. Overall, this Rolex weekend was incredible and featured just about every storyline you could possibly imagine. New manufacturers emerging with legitimate speed, teams breaking through for huge wins, and perhaps one of the best and hardest fought finishes that we've seen in a long time. I'm honestly not really sure how we're going to top this race as the season goes on. However, with Sebring right around the corner, I'm sure we'll find a way. Until then, though, you can check out this playlist for an entire recap on everything that happened this Rolex week. A huge shout out to all the channel supporters, though. If you too want to support the show, you can head to patreon.com/offintheS's or click that join button below. Once again, though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.